When working with a pivot table, a good visual representation of the table is through a pivot chart. It's very similar to a standard chart in Excel, but it is constantly in sync with your pivot table. Whenever you make changes to the pivot table layout, the chart will also change immediately. You can create a standalone pivot chart, but it would be better to have it with the pivot table. But when you create a chart by itself, a pivot table is automatically created. In this particular worksheet, you want to create a pivot table. There are no empty rows in this data or empty columns. We'll go to the Insert tab and choose Pivot Chart and drop arrow below it. We'll create a pivot chart, and where do we want to place it? The existing worksheet location. We'll put it in cell J1. Click OK. I'll need a Pivot Chart Fields dialog box to the left so we can focus on what we're doing. Here we come across unfamiliar words like legend and axis. Now we're going to put customer into location called axis category. As soon as we do this, we don't see much happening in the charts, except for the wording disappear. We can bring in some values here and show the number of items sold. As it is a numeric field, we'll click it and it will appear as values in the chart. Now, even if we didn't ask for a pivot table, it's still being created in the background. If we also include product but put product in the legend series, this corresponds to the column labels. So now we have a pivot chart as well as a pivot table, and we can manipulate data within the pivot charts field. As we see to the left, and the pivot table over in columns J and K will react immediately. Let's flip the positioning of product and customer. Now when looking at the pivot table, we'll emphasize the idea that the B&B Spaces customer is our biggest buyer by far. Let's focus more on the product. We'll put product into the axis category and customer into the legend series. We now see emphasis on the different items being sold here. Similar to regular pivot tables, you can have multiple fields working at the same time, so possibly we want to bring the region right next to the product. This makes the chart very busy. Whenever you're working with pivot charts, a strong suggestion is when the chart gets too busy looking according to yourself, click the chart, go to the Design tab in the ribbon, and then change the chart type on the right to a stacked column or bar. You can also change the style of the chart. A cleanup will make the chart appear less busy. The more you work with pivot charts, the more you'll see that the pivot tables are not very large, sometimes do display a chart that is quite crowded. If we no longer want it, just delete it. If we change our minds later, in any existing pivot table, regardless of its layout, if you want to create a pivot chart, you can simply press Alt F1, which creates a pivot chart. So you can create a pivot chart along with a pivot table, or activate it later, or delete it whenever you want to.